So starting straight in, we're going to get into painting and weathering this little Tamiya 1/35th scale Willis Jeep. Here I'm priming the body, or the tub as it's known in the Jeep world. I'm using Vallejo Surface Primer Gray, but I'm going to use a black basing technique, but at the moment I don't have any black primer, and well, at least not in an airbrushable form. I've got spray can, but it's a little nasty outside right now, so we're gonna go with a little bit of craft paint I've thinned down and just give everything a quick sort of an overcoat of black. After that, we're going to come back with some Vallejo white to bring out the highlights. It's a technique, I believe it's called zenithal highlighting, that I see used in the mini painting community, and thought I'd give it a try here. Although I think I may have overdone it a little bit, but I think it'll be fine. I don't have the exact color I was looking for the base coat. It needs to be your military olive drab, but the story I'm telling within it, it's not a brand new off-the-line paint job. It's going to be a little bit faded, but everything I have, it just doesn't seem to be quite right. Digging through my stash of paint, I did find this Vallejo olive green, which was way too dark for what I wanted, but it had the right tone, and I ended up having to add a fair amount of Vallejo pale sand to lighten it up. I'm sorry I don't have a ratio. I just did it by eye, which is kind of the way I do everything. I mixed it up in a small dropper bottle, so I made enough paint to completely cover the Jeep a couple of times if needed. This is basically insurance. If I screw it up royally and need to start over, I'll have what I need and I won't have to go back and try and recreate it all over again. I'm using my favorite airbrush here for base coating. It's just an old cheap one. I call it Frankenstein because it's got parts in it from 3 different airbrushes that I've used to keep it going. It's a 0.5 millimeter nozzle, but the needle, I have no idea. It doesn't match, but it works, so I've just sort of left it alone. You can clearly see at this point that the steering wheel is firmly attached to the body, but it didn't take me very long to break it off once I started painting. And I'm not going to get into it here, but the steering wheel was a disaster, and I had to go to some pretty extreme measures to fix it, I think it was significant enough that I'm going to make a separate video about it, and when it's ready, I'll put a link up in the corner. You'll notice that the frame hasn't been pre-shaded, so I actually want it dark, and we're going to make it even darker as we go along with some different washes and stuff. Starting in on the tires, I created a mask for these out of a piece of cardstock to paint the rims, but it didn't work very well. The paint ended up going everywhere anyway, so I just discarded that and went with the airbrush and just tried to stay somewhat close to the rim. I got to come back and paint the tires anyway, so I think it turned out pretty well considering. After I finished the tires, I still wasn't thrilled with the base coat on the Jeep. It was just darker than I wanted, and because I don't know, it just didn't feel right. So I went back and lightened up the Jeep paint again with some more of that pale sand, and then did a second coat. But I think, to be accurate, it was really kind of more of a filter or just a highlight to lighten everything up. Once I was happy with that, I went back to work on the interior parts. These kits are fun from start to finish, but this is really the most fun for me. Is I enjoy the detail painting probably more than any other aspect of these kits. This is a Tamiya kit, but I only have Vallejo paints, so I'm using the paint chart in the instructions more as a guide. I don't have a substitute list that I can use to translate them. I'm sure one exists. I just don't have it here, and it just seems a little bit of a bother. So matching the paint is actually part of the fun for me. As I've mentioned in the past, that this is a hobby for me, and creating stress is not part of my philosophy of making. It's supposed to be enjoyable, and if there's an aspect of a project that gets in the way of that joy, you go around it, you skip over it until you can come back and figure it out. You try to work with what you have and enjoy the project in front of you. So here I'm working on the frame and the engine. I'm concentrating on the exhaust right now, and I'm using Vallejo's Rust Texture from their mech weathering line. It's slightly darker than I wanted, but it looks good, and I like the effect, and it's really going on well. And it's giving me the effect I'm looking for, but it's still going to need a little something extra. One of the aspects I enjoy is using my personal frame of reference about the world around me and my, the things I've done in the past to inform a paint job. So you can see how the muffler goes under the skid plate or above it, depending on your point of view. The skid plate is protecting the exhaust, but in order to do this, it's got to be pretty close. So the heat from the exhaust is going to transfer into the plate, and it's going to cause a different wear pattern there. Taking that in mind, I'm extending the rust texture from the exhaust to the skid plate as well, but again, this effect is going to fade out, and it's not going to be just a straight boom. Here's an exhaust pipe shaped outline. There's going to be a transition back into the rest of the skid plate and this is where your frame of reference and your kind of your imagination work together to decide how far back that transition should go and how dark should it be and how much gradient should be used to get to that effect. Now then, how do you manipulate paint to create that gradient? Well, it sounds pretty complicated, but it's actually not difficult to achieve. If you've ever brush painted anything from, I don't know, a mailbox to a concrete step to whatever, you know what happens when your brush runs out of paint. So what you're going to do is working from the wet to the dry area, and you want to start with just enough paint on your brush to where you're going to run out of paint before you get to where you want to go with that color. So as you're running out of paint, it's going to get thinner and thinner and lighter and give you that transition and gradient that you're looking for. Here I'm throwing down a lighter color on the muffler itself. The color of this doesn't really matter that much. It's more of I'm wanting something that's lighter but sort of still in the brown family. I think this is khaki, I believe. So what I'm doing is I'm just going over the muffler itself and not the exhaust pipe. My goal here is that I'm going to pre-lighten the muffler a little bit because I want that rust texture to be lighter in this area, because typically the exhaust itself will weather slightly a different color than the exhaust pipe. So I laid down a thick coat and then came back and removed most of it. Again, I'm looking for a bit of a gradient. In the end, it didn't end up lightening up that much in comparison to the amount of paint I put on it originally, but again, that's on purpose. Once that dried a little bit, but it was still a little tacky, I came back and mixed in some of Vallejo's Game Effects Rust, which is very orange, and started to mix it in a little bit at a time into the rust texture to just alter that color and bring out some more of the oranges. And then I used this to make the rust look more like rust and not like paint, which is, kind of the goal. So far on this project, except for the black basing, which was craft paint, all the other paints I'm using on this kit are Vallejo, and this one is the engine soot from the Vallejo mech weathering line. These come already pre-thinned, if you will, but I thinned it down a little more and then laid it on the engine and around all the places that you would find dirt build up on an engine. Now I'm putting together a little quick mixture of the Vallejo black wash and the Vallejo rust wash, and started laying that in on the underside of the frame. It's not been assembled yet. I'm just sort of holding it together with my fingers here and putting it on the body over the frame so that the engine is in the bay, and then putting the top on the engine and then weathering everything together. So after that, it'll come back apart, and then I can still work on other things. Coming back to the small bits for some more detail work on the jerry cans, and I'm trying to match the strap on the jerry can pretty close to the seat covers, but I'm also going to give the jerry can a slightly different shade of green. I'm going to darken up my base paint with a little bit of some flat green. These things are not probably not all made in the same factory as the Jeep, and the paint colors aren't going to be exactly the same, at least not the ones I've had firsthand experience with in many cases. The jerry cans themselves were not exactly the same color. They were close, but still, historically, I would imagine that, during wartime, close enough was going to get it out the door rather than trying to precisely match a paint color. So this is somewhat on purpose. It's just kind of how my brain works. I'll work on something for a little while, and I'll get to a stage, and I'm like, okay, am I done with this? And if I'm not 100% certain, I'll set it aside and then wait a day and then come back to it and look at it again. If you've been working on something for a while, and you can become objectively blind because you've been working on each little detail and you're not able to see the whole thing. So put it aside for a little bit and come back, you'll be able to see the whole thing. Case in point, I had previously weathered the chassis, and now I'm coming back and going, yeah. So here I'm adding just some straight Vallejo rust wash, and I'm laying it on kind of heavy, but it will blend in and sort of all look like one thing instead of, it's not going to stand out. At least that's the plan. I was working on the chassis, and it just popped into my head, and I grabbed the body and just laid down a coat of the rust wash on the bottom of it and up into the engine bay. It turned out to be, I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but it worked out really well. So I'm going to keep this little thing in mind for future projects. So it did darken the underside, kind of the way I was looking for. I was already planning at this point to come back and do some additional weathering and even chipping on top of that once the rust wash had settled in a bit. So back to the chassis. I came back again and I've thinned out some black wash and then concentrated it on the mechanical points. These are the areas where things move. So there would be grease fittings or other required lubrication on the chassis. And as dirt and dust accumulate and it mixes with that lubricant, it's gonna make dark places. Now, this part, I don't know, it might be a little controversial, but Willis and Ford, the companies manufacturing the Jeeps, used red oxide primer on the tubs and sometimes on the frame, but you were likely to find multiple colors of primer on these vehicles, but mostly black and red. I don't know, I'm not going to call it a homage or anything, but I wanted to start the chipping with the red oxide, or at least as close as I could get to it. For this, I'm using a piece of sponge firmly attached to the end of an object. In this case, it's a magic eraser, which I had handy, and a pair of hemostats, but it could be tweezers or taped to a stick or just your fingers, whatever works for you. So this may be a good time to talk about point of reference for weathering a vehicle, really for anything. The story I want to tell here is of a vehicle that was used in England before D-Day, probably arriving in late 1942 or early 1943. And once it was there, it was used in training exercises and to haul people around, but it was also meticulously cared for by a motor pool sergeant. Yeah, I mean, these things weren't just handed out as part of your kit. You had to requisition it, and then one was assigned to you, and then you had to turn it back in, and when you were done, and Lord help you if this thing was filthy and beat up when you did. You could get written up, or worse. Then, in probably late May of 1942, it was loaded up and hauled to Europe for D-Day. So by the time this vehicle saw combat for the first time, it wasn't even 2 years old yet, which means the paint job was probably likely in pretty good shape. So, you can imagine it going over rough terrain and mud and what have you, and that informs where I'm applying the chipping to look like, the green paint was chipped off the primer. But the primer is still intact underneath, except for maybe the impact points. This is where the rocks and logs and dirt and mud would have abraded the bottom of the Jeep, around the fender wells and on the frame, and just from the soldiers climbing in and out of it and dropping gear and banging into it. Now, combat and training are two different things. I mean, this thing, its purpose is it's a tool of war, and its job was to help troops complete a mission, and that's what I'm trying to represent. Also, you got to know that the primer had to have been damaged as well in some places, so imagining the impact point, I'm coming back with the rust texture again and starting to add those impact points or where there's going to be bare metal that has started to rust. Taking a bit of break from the weathering, I've come back and I'm painting on the tools on the side. There's a shovel and axe that comes standard issue on the side of these Jeeps, and I had glued them on prior to painting. In hindsight, though, I wish I'd left these off and painted them separately because, I mean, from the distance, the paint job looks okay, but I think the effect would have been better if the items had been painted separately and then applied, especially where the axe head is positioned, because once it was glued on, it just sort of melted into the body a little bit, and I lost those edges around the axe where it should have shown a definite separation between the two surfaces. As you work, I mean, you should always be keeping an eye out for those little happy accidents. These are some of the things that make a hobby enjoyable. Here, I'm taking advantage of those little happy accidents. So I had to mix up some paint for the hip pads. And again, we're trying to match the seat color, but it wasn't exactly the same. I mean, it wasn't completely matching. But lucky happenstance, since the color wasn't exactly right, I was able to apply it on top of the seat covers to help it just sort of blend into the hip pads and also provide some variation in color on the fabric, which is more like what you would find on real Jeeps of the period. Again, we're trying to make the thing look like the thing and not like a painting. So any opportunity you can find to add that extra little something, you want to grab that and go with it. So now we're sort of coming to my nemesis, which is decals. I'm still not going to say I'm on speaking terms with them, but I don't worry about these things like I used to. But that said, they're still an adventure, and I'm not going to say it's an adventure in frustration, but the decals are a bit intense for me, and they're kind of high stakes if you think about it as far as models go. I mean, you can go back and sand off, paint, but the decals, if you tear those up, they're more or less gone. So in many cases, you're just screwed. And you're just not going to be able to get it to look the way you want it to. Originally, I had intended to just do a clear coat over the entire body for the decals, but as I looked at it and studied it, it really, the hood was the biggest one, and everything else was kind of just small and didn't take up a lot of real estate. So I decided to do spot treatments instead. And what I use for spot treatments is usually the Pledge floor polish in most cases. But I did not apply it correctly on the hood, and it really ended up acting more like paint remover. And as you can see, I had to go back and fix that. But it turned out okay. Once the decal was down, there was no hint of the former error, thank goodness. Now, on the star on the passenger side, that one was a real booger. It would not stay in place. The star on the US, it points up straight, so it looks like it's got a head and two legs. So as you can see, I'm fighting with it and to get it into the correct position, and then I'm chasing the angles and with the Jeep, and I turn it around, get it in position, and then oops, it's upside down, and then I have to go back and move it again, and I finally got it in place, but it was a fight. After that, though, the rest of them went on pretty much without any drama at all. So yeah, so we're here to final assembly, and before diving back into weathering, and yeah, I don't know, I've tried several different methods of gluing painted parts together, from scratching some of the paint off and using model cement to different PVA glues, but here I'm using a thin super glue, and it's very thin, and I'm using with a little accelerator and a dropper bottle. This is something I need to work on, is controlling the glue and getting it just where you want it and nowhere else, especially super glue. I mean, this stuff can run and ruin a model, and just with an inadvertent squeeze of the bottle. In the past, I've tried thinning down some medium CA glue with acetone, but it just doesn't give me the control I'm looking for. I mean, for the love of Pete, you've got to have a product that has pinpoint control and excellent adhesion, and if you know one, I'd love to know what it is. Anyway, after I got the chassis where I wanted it and avoided gluing my fingers to anything, I glued in the seats and then went to work on the headlights. For this, I'm using Zap canopy glue. It's a Formula 560, I believe. I picked this stuff up in a hobby shop in Nashville, and it's been fantastic for clear parts. I can't recommend it enough. It's thin, but it doesn't take a lot to hold, and being a PVA glue, it's going to dry clear and basically disappear. I gave the same treatment to the windscreens and then set everything aside to dry. And I know what you're thinking. I could use the PVA glue for the frame assembly or for the model assembly, but again, the drying time is sort of my holdback on that. I want it to set pretty quick so that I can move on to the next thing, and I don't have to wait 5 minutes between every little attachment. Getting back to some of the small bits, there's, I don't know what to call it. It's called the accessories of war. There's an M1 Garand, there's a Thompson, and a Browning M1919, along with an ammo can. Painting these are fun. I mean, I didn't really look at the chart. I just sort of picked out what I thought it should look right and went with it. I mean, obviously, there's a little Vallejo gunmetal in the mix, but I think the leather case on the Thompson came out particularly well. So jumping around again, I'm back in the engine compartment and started detailing some of the bits and pieces under the hood. At this point, I still hadn't made up my mind whether I was going to stage it with the hood up or the hood down. So until I made up my mind, I went ahead and painted the stuff anyway. So, and even if I did glue it down, I would know what was under there. Sort of back to my glue conundrum. I attached the M1 with the canopy glue because at this point I was a little scared of the super glue after the near miss with the chassis, and it worked out really well though. I mean, it does tax your ADD a little bit because you have to set it aside and wait for it to set. The little cube I'm using as a stand here is just a visual reference I made for sketching. I mean, I'm horrible at 3D drawing, and this thing sort of helps me visualize what I'm doing. That it's coming in handy for this is just, again, it's a happy accident. In fact, I'm actually thinking about building a purpose-made stand for doing this stuff, only a little bigger, and I don't know, maybe with some more features of some sort, but, I'm still thinking about that. If you've got any ideas or know of something that already exists, I'd really love if you could, put a comment down there and let me know what it is. So back to weathering. With the red oxide primer chipping, I wanted to carry that higher up on the body to those areas where, there would be some additional wear and tear. So I concentrated on the edges around the fenders, the floor, and other points of contact, just from where you're climbing in and out of it, and then, hauling things around. And then I came back around and mixed up a little toned down metallic to just show where the primer had been worn all the way through to the metal, and blended that in with a lighter and a darker shade. As I'm working through the story in my head of the Jeep, I decided to glue the ammo can and canopy down before proceeding with my special homemade brown wash. This is a pretty simple mix of some water-soluble ink with my homebrew thinner and a bit of acrylic paint with just a little extra flow improver added so that it will find its cracks and crevices. I know it feels like a point of no return, and you got to be scared to death when you start lathering this stuff on, but you just have to have faith that it will work out and it'll look okay when it's done. I added a little dab of white paint and lightened it up so that I could work to bring out the details around the fender wells and the wheels. I know it looks like a soupy mess, but it really does clean up very nice. And with a little bit of a Q-tip work there at the end, that's my version of a 1/35 scale Tamiya MB quarter-ton 4x4 truck there before your very eyes. This thing was a blast to build, and I've already ordered another one, so there'll be a companion for this one at some point. So there's going to end up being some companion videos to this, and I'm going to do a quickie on the brown wash and how you can actually make some other colors as well. And it'll be one fixing the disaster of the steering wheel. That'll be coming up soon. So keep an eye out for those. But in the meantime, the first video of the series is right here, and just keep an eye out for the other two. They'll be up here when they're ready. Thank you so much for joining me, and again, go make something. Have fun.